Okay. Welcome again, everyone, to the City of Shoreline Climate Champion Series. We're thrilled to have you here tonight. I'm Heather Teagarden. I'm with WSU Extension, and we are going to be hosting tonight. We're partnering with City of Shoreline on this Climate Action Series, Climate Champion Action Series, and we're happy to be here with you tonight as we talk about the Food and Climate Recipe for Success. So tonight is our 6th out of 7th weekly educational presentation in this series. So hope that you've had a chance to see some of the others, and if not, welcome for the first time. So tonight we're going to learn about how food plays a role in fighting climate change. And we'll briefly discuss how food you choose and waste can contribute to your carbon footprint and how what you eat really does matter. We will also be exploring the food-climate connection and how you can take action to reduce your food print in a sustainable kitchen. Specifically, we're going to be talking about why eating less meat will make our food system more sustainable and how you can make a plan to cut down on your meat consumption if that's something you're interested in doing. It's an important thing. Plus, we'll be learning about what soul food is and how to change what you eat to increase your soul food. Then we're going to be transitioning to discover how observing and using the tendencies of living things in your backyard can make your life a little easier, and learn a little more about permaculture principles and how you can make use of them in your backyard to have more delight and less work. So I just want to show you where we're at here. As I mentioned, we're at the 6th session of our Climate Champion series. And just a general note, we're in webinar mode, so we do have all attendees muted with the video turned off. We are monitoring the chat box, and we are also recording this session, and the sessions will be recorded and shared on the shorelinewa.gov/climate website. If you go there and then scroll down to the weekly descriptions, there's a drop down box and you'll see the YouTube video link there. As I mentioned, tonight we're learning about food and climate. We have a recipe for success. Our speakers are Nancy Vandenberg, who's WSU Sustainable Community Steward, and Ram Hariharan, who has an MBA in Sustainable Business. We expect our presentations to run till approximately 8:15. Then we'll have time for question and answers and announcements of what is coming up next week. What we're hoping for you is to be engaged, to ask questions, use the chat box at the bottom of your screen to ask questions from the presenters. We will be taking those questions, and if we don't get them during the presentation, we will be forwarding to ask those at the end. Just ask you to be respectful and considerate. If you need to take a break, please do so. And also, please take our survey. When the webinar is finished, you'll get a link to a survey, and there'll also be a follow-up email tomorrow with resources for you. So first, we're going to take a quick poll to find out how many people are watching. We do this just in case you're sharing your screen with somebody else. We want to get an accurate number of who's watching, and also where you're watching from. So if you could just take a moment here to vote, that would be great. Yeah, that's great. So we're about 80% voted here. We'll just wait a few more seconds to get a few more. Okay, so we'll share the results here. So just so you know, there is about 69% of us are watching on our own, about 20%, 19% of us are watching with a pet, very fun, and 13% are watching with one other person. And then we have over 63% of folks in Shoreline, so that's wonderful. Some other folks outside of the the shoreline area, and one person from outside of Washington State. So thank you very much for participating in that. All right. Let's see here. So I wanted to also do another poll with you real quick. And that is going to be just before I introduce our first speaker. Okay. Which foods have the biggest impact on climate change? Is it poultry, fish, and eggs, grains, fruit, and vegetables, beef and lamb, cheese, butter, pork, and shellfish? So pick what you think. And it's okay to be wrong, because that's what we're here to do, is to learn tonight. But it looks like everybody's voting mostly the same. Got some different answers here. So we'll go ahead and close the voting now, and I'll share the results. Okay, that's right. So for those that answered beef and lamb, that is correct. They are the most carbon intensive foods. Livestock production accounts for about 18% of all greenhouse gases that contribute to climate change. And reducing meals with beef or lamb just once per week for a family of 4 is the same as taking the average car off the road for up to 1,500 miles. So, and cheese, of course, butter, pork, shellfish are also a good second choice, and we'll be talking more about that. As I mentioned, tonight we're going to discuss how the food you choose and the waste you contribute to your carbon footprint, and what you eat really does matter. So here to talk to us about that is my friend and our dedicated volunteer, Nancy Vandenberg. Nancy is a registered dietitian and a sustainable community steward with WSU. She received her bachelor's degree from Miami University of Ohio and her master's in nutritional science from University of Washington. Nancy is now a mostly retired nutrition instructor at Everett Community College. She currently co-teaches a sustainable nutrition course and is co-advisor of the student club of Everett Community College Students for Environmental Action. It's awesome. Her retirement mission is to work on environmental issues. And Nancy, we're thrilled to have you here. So I'm going to be actually sharing Nancy's presentation. So let me do that.
Heather, do I need to close this poll here? Looks like I do.
Okay.
All right. Thanks. Oh, well, so are you ready for me? Looks like it.
I did. I'll push this button down here and then
start the, yeah, you can probably take it more.
Go.
There we go. So thanks, Heather, for that nice introduction. And I guess you figured out what I'm really interested in. I'm, love talking about food and the environment. They're my two favorite topics. So here we are talking about sustainable food. As Heather said, I've been co-teaching a class on sustainable nutrition at Everett Community College. I think we started about 10 years ago. It's hard to believe, but, and it's been a lot of fun. And I have learned a lot from just being in the process of doing that. So I think I hate to date myself, but my interest in the environment dates back to the very first Earth Day. And I think at the time I thought it was all about driving less and recycling. And now I know there's a lot more to it. And food has a lot to do with climate change. And it's quite surprising to people how big a difference it can make. So what you eat really can make a huge difference. So Heather, you can advance my next slide.
All right.
Thank you. Heather's in charge of my PowerPoint here, so I hate to keep bossing her around, but
all right.
Okay. So what we're going to be covering is eating sustainably. talking a little bit about different foods and the carbon emissions for them, which is always really fun and amazing to look at. And then some strategies for lowering your food print, your carbon food print. Also want to talk about soul food, which stands for seasonal, organic, unprocessed, and local, because that's important too, and give you some ideas on how to do that, and also some ideas on food waste reduction. I think that food waste is a huge issue right now. So I'm glad to see that it's finally getting some attention. Okay, so eating sustainably, doesn't this box of food look so pretty? And eating sustainably is also generally eating healthfully. They go together so nicely. If you are eating more sustainably, you are probably eating more healthfully. So that's always a good thing. Okay, so next slide. So just a little bit to talk about the environmental issues with meat production. And let's talk a little bit about how meat is produced in the United States. My husband grew up on a farm, and it was a small farm, and I think they had about maybe 40 or 50 cows. And they grew a lot of the grain there. They, did all of the thing. They ate meat from the cows. They sold milk, and it was a sustainable operation because they were growing their grain and they were using the manure to fertilize. Well, now that's not really the case. And now most of our farms are huge, and cows are raised apart from where grain is raised. So, and because grain is raised in a huge monoculture, which just means a whole lot of one kind of crop on one piece of land, that requires a lot of pesticides. It requires a lot of chemical fertilizer because they don't have the cow manure used anymore. It requires a lot of fuel because you have to truck that grain off to where the cows are a few states away. It requires a lot of feed. It requires a lot of water. So when we're talking about the environmental issues with meat production, a lot of it is how we raise meat in the United States in these very large operations. They're called CAFOs. So those generate a lot of greenhouse gases and a lot of manure. And I remember a few years ago when they were having all of the flooding, there was a huge problem with the manure lagoons because they were getting overtopped, and they were causing a lot of pollution, getting into the groundwater, et cetera. So that is an ongoing problem. The other thing is that all of these extra pesticides and fertilizer and everything like that washes into the groundwater, washes into the rivers, and goes down the Mississippi River and ends up in the Gulf, and there are toxic dead zones there from this. So there are a lot of problems besides just the greenhouse gas problems. It's also a problem of polluting our fresh water as well. So next slide. So as most of you seem to know already, which is great, the biggest environmental impact of our eating, not the greatest environmental impact in total, but when it comes to eating, is the amount of meat that we eat. So what you can do. So first of all, I always like to say that eating less meat does not mean that you can't eat any meat. I think people get really nervous about that. And in the United States, we tend to like meat. We're used to eating a lot of meat. So I'm certainly not going to say that you have to eat no meat. Now, if you want to do that, great. I'm all for it. I mean, many of you are probably vegetarians or vegans already. That's wonderful. I always tell a story. I mentioned my husband grew up on a dairy farm. Well, they used to eat meat 2 or 3 times a day. And he is such a good sport now that he is eating meat maybe 2 or 3 times a week maximum, and in pretty small quantities too. So, but this was a slow process. I always tell people, start where you are and cut down. If you're eating meat every day, maybe you want to try 1 day a week that you're not eating meat. If you are eating, maybe not very, not necessarily every day, but you eat huge portions of meat, maybe cut it into a smaller portion. We don't really need the huge meat portions that we are eating. So, kind of make a plan on if you're interested in doing this. And it does make a huge difference, as we'll see in a few minutes. Just kind of start wherever you are right now. Don't feel guilty. Oh my gosh, I'm doing this. Just think, okay, I can do something from wherever I'm starting, wherever my starting point is. Because once you get the ball rolling, then things change. And I know I grew up eating meat every day. In fact, when I was growing up, we thought we'd die if we didn't eat meat every day. We would not get enough protein. That was the thinking of the time. Well, of course, that's not true, but that's what I grew up doing. So it was a gradual process for me to cut down meat. And I'm not totally vegetarian. I always say I'm a vegetarian wannabe, but I haven't quite made it yet. I probably eat meat maybe once a week. And that includes salmon and poultry too. So, but it could be I'm a gradual person. I like to do things piece by piece. Some of you might be willing to just jump in there and change everything. And if you can do that, that's great too. And you can also just start eating lower in the food chain, which we'll talk about a little bit here. So strategies for eating less meat: eat 1 or 2 meatless days a week. Maybe just designate. You may have heard of the Meatless Monday, which we will be looking at their website a little bit later. But their goal is to just encourage people to pick 1 day a week, Monday. Certainly it could be any old day. But sometimes it helps to have that goal in mind. Otherwise you think, oh, I'm going to eat meat less one day. I don't know when I'm going to do it, kind of thing. It takes a little planning. Like any change that you're going to make, you have to really do a little bit of planning before it all kind of comes together. So one way you can start out with is have some canned or dried beans in your cupboard. And I always have these things on hand. My husband is very good about cooking from dry beans. I have to confess, I'm more of a canned bean person because I'm probably not as well planned as he is. But so we have both. You may know that these things got very, very popular at the beginning of the pandemic. And in fact, I went shopping early on, maybe in March, and there were no beans in the bean section. And I was totally amazed, but it made me very happy too, to think that people were actually eating more beans. I thought that was great. Well, then I heard a story in the news a couple months ago that yes, people went out and bought all those beans, but they're still sitting around their cupboards. So we'll talk a little bit about what do you do with them anyway, which I think is always the question. If you haven't cooked with them before, you might be thinking, I have no idea what to do with this can of beans. Okay, so we'll talk about that. The other thing you can do is eat items that have a little bit lower food print than red meat. If you eating chicken, eating fish, eating eggs, and we'll take a look at that right now on the next slide. Okay, so what this slide is showing you, the green line is the carbon emissions during production of food. So you can see that's most of it for most of these foods. And then the orange part is the post emissions, the post-farm emissions, like processing and transportation and cooking and all of those kinds of things. You can see that it's mostly the production of these crops that uses most of the carbon. But if we start over here on the left-hand side, lamb, you can see, is the biggest in terms of carbon emissions. It's very high compared to beef, which is right up there as well. And then you can drop down, and cheese, even though it's high, is only about half of beef. So just making a switch there. And pork is even less than cheese. So if you're thinking, oh, I like pork, it does generate quite a bit less emissions than beef. And then you go to farmed salmon, turkey, chicken, canned tuna. So you can see that as you're going along, when you start getting into fish, it's much, much lower in terms of emissions. And, it's still meat. Eggs are low. Potatoes, potatoes aren't really an excellent protein source like all these other foods are, but 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 they're just throwing that in there as a comparison too. Peanut butter is another good protein source, quite low compared to meat. Nuts are also a fairly good protein source. Yogurt, broccoli in there. You can see fruits and vegetables, or they don't have any fruits in here, but vegetables are quite low. Okay, so then you've got tofu, and then dry beans, and then at the very, very bottom of this list are lentils. So they are by far the lowest carbon emitters, even lower than a lot of vegetables. So if you like lentils, so here's a great way to use them. So I'm just seeing this question about why is farm salmon listed but not wild? Okay, Heather, can we go back to the chart? I'm going to answer that since we're right here. I don't know. I think they and actually I would recommend wild, and I'm glad you brought up that question. That does make more sense. They just couldn't fit everything into this chart, so I think they're just picking some foods. So if you've never done lentils before, lentils are super easy because you don't have to soak them in advance, and there are lots of lentil soup recipes out there. They're really quick to make. They're delicious. So there's a good place to start, and certainly beans as well. Okay, so I saw another question about why is cheese higher than milk or yogurt. I'll answer that one. I'm probably not going to notice all these chat, but I just happen to see that. It's because cheese, when you take milk and make it into cheese, you're using a lot of milk to make a smaller amount of cheese. So that's the reason for that. So, okay, so let's move on. Eating less meat, how this measures up over a year. So if you eat one less burger a week, it's like taking your car off the road for 320 miles or line drying your clothes half the time. So that's just kind of a little fun comparison. If how it measures up if your 4-person family skips meat and cheese 1 day a week, it's like taking your car off the road for 5 weeks. This is only 1 day a week. So that's kind of a, that's kind of a big hit there. So it really does make a difference. And then if we all did it, if everyone in the United States ate no meat or cheese just 1 day a week, it would be like not driving 91 billion miles, okay, or taking 7.6 million cars off the road. So in other words, this makes a big impact. And I think that just lets you know that this really does make a huge impact, because we certainly always think of driving as having the biggest, and of course it does, but we can make a big difference with our food too. So that's always good to know. There are lots of ways of doing this. So, I'm just going to get 3 votes for the planet every day, and you can certainly start your week with Meatless Monday. Okay, so I'm sure that some of you have heard of the Mediterranean diet pyramid, and this is the way that people in parts of France, Spain, or just all those countries around the Mediterranean, Italy. And so this is just kind of putting this, this type of diet has been very well researched as being very healthy. People who eat Mediterranean diet tend to have lower incidences of heart disease and other chronic diseases. It's been very, very well studied. And it's also very sustainable. But if you're just looking at it from the health benefit thing, notice that it's grain-based, eating a fair amount of grains, lots of vegetables and fruits. And if you look at the daily over here, you're eating grains, vegetables, fruits. Beans and legumes and nuts are the good protein sources that are used on a daily basis. Olive oil, cheese, and yogurt also. And then a few times a week, fish, poultry, eggs, and sweets. So notice that fish is a bigger part of that. So they're really recommending eating fish more often than the other foods here. And then red meat is at the very top here, a few times a month in small quantities. So again, you might want to use this as an aspirational thing. And certainly, I am not recommending that if you're eating meat every day now that you necessarily have to get to just a few times a month. But this is a very healthy way of eating. Especially if you have health risks, it's something to think about and kind of gradually move toward. And I always say that if you're going to start changing your diet, pick the easy thing first. What's going to be easy for you? Maybe it's easy for you to cut down your meat. Or switch to more fish and poultry. Okay, so that's a great place to start. Maybe it's easy for you to switch your oils to olive oil. Maybe it's easy to eat more vegetables and fruits, which automatically means you're going to be eating less meat. So kind of pick a place to start that that makes sense to you, and then you can move into some of those harder changes, because what I found with I've been teaching nutrition for a long time. What I found with my students is I always tell them, try to make one change a week, because it takes a while to make something a habit. Maybe you just want to add a fruit every day and make that change. And then by the end of the quarter, you'll have made 10 positive changes. So, think more long-term about what you might be doing. And one positive change tends to lead to another. There's a snowball effect here. And pretty soon you'll not only be eating more healthfully, but you'll certainly be eating more healthfully for the planet. So, okay, so some plant-based eating tips, including more fruits and vegetables in meals. And if you've ever seen My Plate, the My Plate icon, they recommend having half of your plate be fruits and vegetables. And personally, I think that's a great idea. And actually in our house, it's even more than half the plate, generally speaking. But it's a kind of an easy way to look at it if you can, try to. And I always tell people, when you're going to the grocery store, start in the produce department. And then load up your cart there, and you won't have a lot of room for anything else. But also don't buy more than you think that you're going to be able to eat. Making some Meatless Monday recipes. So Heather, can we go over to the Meatless Monday site? I don't know if I can click on it, or do you need to click on it?
Nancy, I wanted to see what you thought about the idea of going there when we're done with the presentation, just so is that okay?
Sure, that's fine.
Okay.
Okay, and then stocking up on some plant-based staples. So that means beans, we talked about that. Tofu, if you've never cooked with tofu before, we can talk about that a little bit. It's great in stir fries. Try out some things that maybe you haven't tried before. And there are a lot of plant-based proteins out there. And if you've ever been under the impression that, we have to eat meat, no, we don't. We're fine. We can eat the plant-based proteins, and we will really be okay with that. Also, buying spices or growing your own herbs is super easy, and it's a great way to spice up your foods. If you're really uncomfortable with this, and you haven't you've never done this before, you might try. You could go to the library and get some vegetarian cookbooks and see which ones you like. I usually don't recommend cookbooks because I think cookbooks are really personal. You have to kind of look at it and see if this cookbook speaks to you, if it has the kind of recipes that you think you like, if it's written in a style that you find engaging. I'm one of these people that actually reads cookbooks. So I would just kind of go check them out and see what you have. There are also tons of recipes on the Meatless Monday website, which we're going to look at the end. So we will check that out. And if you can get your whole family involved and look at it as an adventure, then it's all how you approach these things, right? Make it sound like it's going to be really fun. And I think kids like to cook. They enjoy that. So. Okay, so kind of that's about meat. We talked about that, which is really an important thing. And then I think another way of looking at what is sustainable food is to think soul food. So these are kind of, you know, we always have to have an acronym for everything. So if you can kind of think about these things when you're shopping, seasonal, organic, unprocessed, and local. So we'll talk about all of these individually. So the first one's seasonal. And I think that this is the hardest to accomplish because right now is great, although we're a little bit past we're a little bit past when a lot of things are in season. If you're a gardener, you know that, kind of goes through the whole summer and you have certain things at certain times. Early on in the season, you get more lettuce and things like that. And then later on, it's tomatoes. And now we're into winter squash. Kale, you can pretty much grow year round. We have an apple tree in our backyard, and that's just starting to, produce right now. And again, it depends on what variety you have. And you can certainly buy in farmers markets, although they're starting to close down too. But that's a great way to buy seasonal produce and support our local farmers, which is, if we want to have farmers, we can go buy from them. That's a really great thing to do. Also, you can preserve, you can freeze, you can can foods for later. So I guess I have a little easy challenge for buying local, that maybe we could all start making our own jam. I know it's too late for this year, but there's almost always seasonal berries around, in more than one, certainly, and they're local. And making jam is super easy, especially if you make freezer jam. But even canning it is pretty easy. Just one little caveat on canning, I don't know if any of you can, but it is virtually impossible to find canning jar lids now. And luckily for me, I had enough left over from last year because I did not anticipate this. But again, this is one of those shortages that I'm kind of happy about, because it makes me happy that people are actually canning. But it's, another pandemic thing that we probably didn't predict, that, people were, I guess we should have predicted it. People were growing a lot more gardens and doing things like that. We should have known that we were going to need to stock up on canning jars lids early. But it is a great way of preserving some of the harvest, even if you just do it a little bit. That's great. Okay, so the next one's organic. So Heather, let's go look at the Dirty Dozen. I'm not used to not having a class where I can see you all. So I was going to ask you a question, and then I realized, no, you can't. I can't see you anyway. So the Dirty Dozen, this is a list of fruits and vegetables that are most likely to be contaminated by pesticides if you don't buy them organic. So if you've never really bought organic before, I'm certainly not going to suggest you, start doing all organic, because that's kind of overwhelming. You probably won't be able to find a lot of foods you usually buy anyway. But if you can just maybe start with a few things. And can we get to that site?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
It's on.
So I'll show you. This is a wonderful website that Heather is going to send you. And these are the top 12 things that if you're thinking, I want to buy a few things organic, these are probably the best place to start. So the first one, they always get a lot of pop-up things in this website. That's the only bad thing about it. So strawberries were number one. That conventionally grown strawberries have a lot of pesticides in them. And another really good reason for buying organic strawberries is to protect the farm workers who are out there working in the fields, because they're the ones that are getting the brunt of the pesticides that are being sprayed. And that's particularly true in strawberries. Spinach is another one. Kale, it's very, very easy to grow your own kale. Let's see, we can, nectarines, apples, grapes, peaches, cherries, pears, tomatoes, celery, and potatoes, and then they've got a 13th one down here of hot peppers. So if you are just starting out buying organic, here's a good place to start. It is more expensive to buy organic, but sometimes it's not that much more expensive. Okay, we lost the PowerPoint. I'm sure Heather's going to get it.
I have to
Okay.
click in and then click out. So
Oh yeah, I know how that goes. It's kind of crazy. So the best sources of organic are food co-ops, which we have local food co-ops. There's one in Everett. There's one in Mount Vernon. I live in the Snohomish area. I know in Edmonds they have some. I'm not sure about Shoreline. I'm sorry, but you can check that out. Also, farmers markets are excellent, and lots of times at farmers markets, the farmers are not certified organic. So let me just explain what that means. Certified organic means they go to your farm. You have to do a lot of paperwork, but they do inspections. They do things like that. Oftentimes, the people that sell at farmers markets are not certified organic because they don't have the money. It costs money to do that. But they will oftentimes say that they don't spray, they don't use pesticides, they just aren't certified organic. So if you're comfortable with that, that is certainly a great place to buy. And it's a very fun place to go. It's always fun to go to the farmers markets, and you get to talk to the farmers too, so you can ask them questions, and they really want to share their information. And the other thing is that a lot of just regular old grocery stores are starting to have really good organic sections. It kind of depends on the store, and it depends on the area. Check that out. And usually it depends on the store. Some of them have their organic kind of sprinkled in with the rest of their things, and some of them have a separate organic section. So you may have to look around a little bit to find things. And again, if you have not been buying organic, I'm not suggesting that you switch over and buy everything organic, but maybe just kind of start out with a few things and work your way. That's certainly what I started doing when I started buying organic. Again, price is a problem too. I mean, sometimes it's just a little bit more expensive. Sometimes it's significantly more. So you have to be sustainable in lots of different ways. Unprocessed, this is my favorite one because the less processed our food is, the healthier it's going to be. And as a dietitian, I really like that. And also, it's going to have far less packaging. That's the other problem with processed food, is it has a lot of packaging, most of which is not recyclable. It's just garbage. So generally speaking, the more processed something is, the more packaging it's going to have that you throw away. And I'm a big person for waste reduction too. And you've probably all heard about the problem with plastics. And a lot of them are single-use plastics that come with our food. So one thing we can do is reduce our fast food consumption. Shop around the perimeter of the store. That doesn't mean you can't walk down in the aisles, but you don't have to walk down every aisle. The perimeter of the store, that's where the produce is, that's where your basic foods are. You probably are going to have to walk down the aisle and buy flour or whatever, which is fine, but try to stay away from those really heavily processed and heavily packaged kinds of things, and certainly do not aim for perfection. I'm not going to come back and grade you all next week, although just trying to, I'm always like a believer in progress rather than perfection. If you're doing better than you did a month ago or a couple months ago, then that's great. And also, especially if you have a family, you need to get your family on board and used to these changes as well. So it's all about how you present it in a positive way too, but it's a difference. So that's something to think about. Learning to cook. That's probably one of the best things that you can do to eat sustainably. And certainly if you're going to eat unprocessed, learning to cook is really helpful. And that's where I think it's great to get other people involved. If you have kids, if you're roommates, other people that you're living with, it's a great thing to do together. It's a great way to spend time together. And in our college sustainable food systems class, we all cooked together. Well, before the pandemic, we all cooked together, and that was the students' favorite thing. And they learned how to cook, and they found out it can be really fun. Packaging alternatives. I always think, what's the end product? You know, if I'm buying something, what can I do with this packaging? Is it recyclable or not? And if it's not recyclable, I just don't buy it. So, but sometimes you can't avoid a little bit. So there are some things you just really can't do this. Okay, so we can move on a little bit. Local food, and the definition of local, certainly it varies from, you know, person to person, but you may have seen these challenges of eating everything within that's, you know, eating only within 100-mile parameter of your house or whatever. Well, the best local is your own backyard. And so starting a garden, and I have to confess here, I love to garden. I love to be outside. I love to garden, but I'm not really very good at it, to tell you the honest truth. I never really quite know why my plants are successful or not successful. I just keep experimenting. I'm working on. I think it's always kind of good to like to do something that you're not good at. So that's what I keep telling myself. So I'm not a pro, but I started with very easy things. Years and years ago, when we first moved into our house, I started planting herbs, oregano. Oregano is a perennial. I love perennials. Next year it's going to come back. You don't have to plant it again. This is fantastic. And it's not very fussy either. It just kind of grows any old place. Parsley is extremely easy to grow, and it's a biennial, meaning it'll come back another year, but usually it reseeds itself anyway. Rosemary is perennial. There are lots of things, and they are so easy. And also rhubarb. You can get a rhubarb root, and it is a perennial, and it will last for years and years, and that makes it really easy. So doing things like that is great. Fruit trees, berry bushes. I think it was when I read Animal Vegetable Miracle about Barbara Kingsolver's family and how they switched to, they were eating everything within 100 miles. And she inspired me, and I went and ripped out all the juniper bushes along our driveway and put in blueberry bushes. So that was my first big thing. And let me tell you, we had quarts and quarts and quarts of blueberries this year. So that's really fun. And our fruit trees, oh my gosh, we had so many cherries and quite a few apples. So, and those things come back every year. You put them in, you don't have to do anything with them again, and that's better for me. But certainly growing vegetables is a great idea too. Even if you just start, again, small. If you are like me and a novice gardener, I never really gardened until I was an adult. You don't want to, go out and plow up the whole backyard, because that's discouraging. Start really small. Start with a small plot. Start with a couple pots. It's amazing how much you can do. Farmers markets. Again, we talked about that before. They support local farms, less food miles. You can buy direct from local farms. I buy my apples direct from the farmer, and it's so fun. I have a relationship with this farmer now, and I love it. It's just kind of like every October we go out and buy apples. And you can do that with and I have a friend, actually, I forgot to mention this when I was talking about meat, so we can talk about it right now. You can get local meat too. And I have a friend who raises local beef, and it's grass-fed. So when I do eat meat, that's what we eat for meat. It comes from a local farmer. It is grass-fed, so it's not involved in the industrial food system. And there are a lot. You'd be amazed when you start looking around. You would be amazed how you can buy from local farms, directly from the farm or via farmers market. The other thing is to check labels and see where things come from. There's certainly no reason for us to be buying apples from New Zealand, because we have plenty of apples in Washington. Although you do see, oddly enough, apples from New Zealand, which seems crazy to me. You can't buy everything local. I mean, obviously, we don't grow bananas here, and that's okay. I'm not saying you have to buy everything local. I think most of us aren't ready to give up coffee. We can't grow that locally either, but we can certainly buy ethical coffee, which is good. So, okay, so that's kind of about soul food, some ideas. So just a few other random thoughts that I had. Set your table with cloth napkins. You don't have to iron these. I do not iron. And you can even use them more than once. And then you can just throw them in the dishwasher in the clothes washer, and you can keep using them. Using cloth dish towels. There's no reason to buy paper towels. If you have to clean up something really ucky and yucky, then use an old sock that has holes in it, and then you can just throw the whole thing away. But you don't need to go buy paper towels. So, and these are, more things about cutting down waste. And really, we already talked about this, be mindful of plastic when you're shopping. Okay, so a little bit about food waste prevention, and this is from King County, who has great, and you've probably heard various statistics about food waste, that we waste 25% of our food, a third of our food, half of our food. It kind of depends on who you're talking to, but we waste way more food than we should. And that happens at all along the, from the farm to our house. There's food waste all along the line. And so whatever we can do to stop that is good. So here's the landfill. We certainly don't want our food ending up there. So let's take a look at the next. So I think one way to cut down food waste is think what food in your house is going to waste. So do a little audit. What are you throwing away? Maybe you're always buying too many bananas or whatever it is, what seems to end up and why. So adjusting your shopping a little bit can help that. Certainly composting is a great idea. It's better to not waste it in the first place. But composting, and I compost everything, my banana peels, my eggshells, all of those kinds of things. And there's various ways of doing this. You can throw them in your yard waste container. That's easiest way. And that's fine because they turn that into compost. If you want your own compost, you can have a compost pile. You can also have a worm bin. I have a worm bin, and those worms make the nicest compost that you've ever seen. And they just take all my tea and coffee grounds and banana peels and whatever, and turn it into wonderful compost. I'm not going to get into how to do that today, but you can check out, there's lots of resources on how to start a worm bin or how to start your own compost pile. Okay, so let's see, we can move on here.
Nancy, I wanted to really quick interject. The reason that we want to reduce food waste and we don't want food in the landfill is because we don't want items in the landfill to rot. We want items in the landfill to just stay preserved as they are, because when things start to break down, then that causes more of methane and greenhouse gas. So that is the big reason food should go in your garbage. Food scraps should go in your yard waste bin. And the great thing about yard waste bins is the commercial composting can accept everything. They can accept meat, bones, eggshells, as Nancy was saying, cheese. They can accept food soiled paper, like plain paper plates, not any with the design, just, plain napkins, items like that. So that's why we wanted to make sure you saw that landfill.
Yes, because methane from rotting food is a huge greenhouse gas problem, more than carbon. It's even worse. So yes, definitely. So I there's really no reason for food waste, as Heather said, because the yard waste container takes everything. But if you want to divert some of it for your own use, then you can certainly do some of these other things too. Okay, so
oh, sorry, Nancy. I'll just also add that I added this question for myself today. Where does food that goes down the disposal actually go? And I talked to a gal at City of Everett today, and really the municipalities that manage wastewater treatment do not want any food in there either. So really,
yeah.
all food scraps, it clogs up their systems. And so food scraps really should go in the compost where they can regenerate into new things. So
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really great point. In fact, we never use our disposal. And when I was growing up, we just thought that was an automatic. But and the other thing that you can do is use some of your vegetable, if save some of your vegetable pieces and make vegetable broth from them. And so, there's other things you can do too. So here's the problem with wasting food. When you waste food, you're not just throwing away the food, which as Heather mentioned, causes methane problems and everything else. But you're also wasting all the resources that went into producing that food. And I think that's one of the advantages of gardening, is you start to realize, wow, this food is really valuable stuff. We tend to not think of it that way. But 25% of our freshwater use in the United States, 5% of our energy use, 6% of greenhouse gas emissions from wasted food. That's a lot of precious resources just getting thrown away. And I love this one, that if we grew all of our wasted food on one farm, it would cover an area larger than Canada. So again, that is a lot of food waste. It's really unfortunate. It's a justice issue as well. People are hungry. We shouldn't be throwing food away. So here's Heather's trivia question that she put in here. How much money does an average family of four spend on food that they don't eat? $1,500. Ouch. That's a lot of money. So you can save well over $100 a month by not throwing away food. And as I said, it's a justice issue. Who's getting hurt if we're wasting food? Besides all of the climate things, etc., we're not feeding people that need to be fed. And I think that we're getting pretty good at diverting excess food to food banks, etc. Right now, a lot of people are going hungry, as we've all heard, with the economic crisis because of the pandemic. And so that in itself, I think, is a really great reason to not waste our food. So let's move on. So I think, it sounds really easy not to throw food away, doesn't it? Sounds really simple, but it's not necessarily that simple. You really have to have a plan. So making a plan, making a grocery list, and stick with it to a certain extent, but sometimes you see things that are really great deals that you need. I mean, I'm not saying be at a straitjacket and do not buy anything that's not on your list. I think the other thing that is to think about, well, how perishable is this food? And especially many of us are shopping less now because we're trying not to go to the grocery store very often. So we're maybe stocking up. I know we are. So I start out with the most perishable foods, use those, the things that I know, the vegetables and fruits that are the most perishable, I'll use those first. Things that are going to last longer, I will, oranges are going to last a long time, potatoes, et cetera. So you can save those like toward the end if you want to. So that's one way of making sure. And just what I always tell people, store foods, this says store them in clear containers, but I'm not encouraging anyone to go out and buy more plastic. You can always label your containers and at the top. Now, in our house, everything is in an old cottage cheese or yogurt container, and it's kind of a family joke that we just open them up and see what's in there. But I could label the tops of them, and then I would know. The other thing is, I think some people are very, very focused on throwing away food if it gets to its label date. And most of the date labels are about quality, not necessarily safety, except for infant formula. I would not recommend using that past its expiration date, so to speak. So, open it up and look at it, and if it smells okay, if it looks okay, it's probably okay, even if it's a day or two past the expiration date. So don't be too intimidated by those. I think on leftovers, maybe you want to, have a section of your refrigerator and actually box it up, and this is what needs to be eaten first. In our house, I put all of my leftovers on one refrigerator shelf in one area, so I know what needs to be used up. The other thing is, kind of have a few recipes that will use up various things. For example, you can make stir fry. If you happen to have a lot of vegetables in your refrigerator that are kind of getting to the point where they need to be used, you don't need to have a recipe. You can just use those and make stir fry. You can certainly use a lot of them in soup or stew. So I always recommend cruise through your refrigerator every couple of days and see what's in there that needs to be used, and make sure that nothing got stuck in the back of the refrigerator that's going to go bad. So I don't know if this is a cute little YouTube video that Heather found. So are we going to watch it? Let's do it. It's pretty short. So there's kind of the sad story of what happens with a lot of our food that gets wasted. And Heather, do I have anything left on the PowerPoint? I think I have a couple things. So there's a lot that goes into it. I think we kind of don't think about it. The farmers, the transportation, all of those kinds of things. So here's back to the video again, and the shopping and the money and all of those things. And then if we don't eat it, we're wasting all of those resources. So
I'm sorry about that.
okay. I think I had well, I'm probably kind of at the end here anyway. So
I like that video because I feel like it's very relatable, and and because it just shows how easy it is to have that happen.
Oh yeah, definitely.
There's just yeah.
We've all done it in spite of our best intentions at some point or another. Okay.
Yes, and also just that it really shows also all the transportation that your food takes to get from the farm to the table. So I wanted to share that as well.
Yeah. So another good reason for growing a little something at home. So first of all, you don't have to do it all. We all have different amounts of time and energy and everything else. So please don't think, oh my gosh, I got to buy organic. I have to buy seasonal. I have to make my own jam. Oh my goodness. No, you don't have to do everything. I'm just giving you some ideas, and pick something that appeals to you. Again, really start with what you do, and then maybe write down a couple changes that you're going to make. And I am a big believer in writing it on a sticky note and tacking it up on the refrigerator. And maybe you want to put some things in the chat of changes that you think you're going to make, because writing it down makes it more real and more, I'm going to actually do this. And they don't have to be big changes. They can be very small changes, because again, changes kind of snowball. So if you start with something, maybe challenge a friend or somebody else in the class or your neighbor. that I'm gonna eat less meat, or I'm gonna do something else. And the other thing is, once you make that goal, I'm going to eat less meat. Well, then remember that you have to think, what am I going to eat instead? So make sure that you buy some beans on your next shopping list, etc. Um, so, so that is about it. And I'm happy to answer questions, which I think, Heather, you have the questions.
Yeah.
So.
Nancy, so one of the questions is, can you talk about the emission reductions of local grass-fed beef compared to CAFO?
Yes. Okay. I don't have the exact numbers. And of course, it depends on the situation. But I can just tell you, let me just give you a general thing. If you are running a big CAFO operation, which is a concentrated animal operation where they're all together, you're going to have train loads or truckloads of food coming in. You're going to have to get rid of the manure. You're going to have all those things. So there's a lot of transportation in that. I don't know exactly the carbon emissions for grass-fed local. I'm sorry that I don't have those numbers. I know it is less, but I think that's an excellent question, and I'm sorry I don't have the numbers on that, because obviously it varies from place to place, but I'll see what I can find. So.
All right, and another, before we go to Meatless Monday, another question was, can you talk about kind of the pesticides, the effects on bees and the disruptors and how it causes cancer and how it's bad for
Yes, there is so much interesting research being done on these things. And we've all heard about BPA, and so now all of our plastics, and that's an endocrine disruptor, which can cause problems, and there's evidence tying it to cancer. The problem is that some of the things that replace those are not a whole lot better. So really, the best idea to avoid a lot of those things is just to stay away from plastics as much as possible. In terms of pesticides, and herbicides that they use, those can get into the groundwater, get into the air, get into the soil, and they persist. And they can, cause, and I think the biggest problems are the people who are directly exposed. As I mentioned, it's the farm workers who are working in those fields where they are spraying pesticides, and they are directly impacted by those. So there are a lot of impacts up and down the line, and it's been hard to study that. I mean, I have seen a lot of contradictory and conflicting studies. So I don't think I can tell you, oh, we know exactly that this is a problem. But they certainly know that they're contributing to dead zones in the Gulf. I mean, that's certainly a good reason right there, and kind of tells you, these things can, if they're killing bugs, they're probably not too good for us either, are they? And it's kind of amazing, I think, that I always laugh at myself that, when I was growing up, pesticides are fine, they're okay. They're all fine. Well, no, we've learned that's not the greatest thing. So
I'm going to share the screen now to share in fact, here's the Environmental Working Group's webpage, and there is
oh yeah, the bees, I forgot about that. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, that was part of the question and I got off on. Yes, I am a big believer in saving bees, and yeah, pesticides are very bad for bees. Of course, they're killing other bugs. Of course, they're going to kill bees too. And it's one of the many things that's causing problems with honeybees. So the other thing we can do to help bees is plant some flowers and things that they like. They love herbs. So they are another way to attract a lot of bees. So yeah, this website is an absolutely great source of a lot of information about all the things that question addresses.
And then I'll share the Meatless Monday one. Excuse me. Is it showing up?
Yes.
Okay.
Perfect. Okay, so this is a wonderful website that has a lot of, let's see, I can't scroll down.
I will.
Yeah, it has a lot of recipes. So if you're just kind of stymied and you don't know what to do for meatless or what to do for beans, they do have a lot of recipes. So yeah, you kind of have to look around a little bit. They did improve this website. It used to be much more cluttered. Okay, so here they are. And I saw that recipe in the middle just looks fantastic to me, as do the vegan nachos. So lots of great recipes here that you can try. And they have a lot of great ideas as well. So.
Okay, great.
Okay.
And did we miss any questions while I was busy trying to navigate the computer here?
I think there were a lot of questions that I don't know. I don't want to open my chat because usually when I do that, I get myself out of Zoom for some reason. So
there was one more that somebody asked, and that was if you could talk about the vitamin B12.
Oh, yes. Okay. Yes. I did see that question, so I'm glad you brought it back up. Yeah, vitamin B12 is only found in animal foods, probably a few plant foods, but basically it's only found in animal foods. So it is a concern for people who go on a vegan diet. Totally, no cheese, no milk, no anything. But it's a very easy, a lot of foods are supplemented with it now. So a lot of foods that are designed for vegetarians have B12 added. For example, soy milk almost always has vitamin B12 added, as do many of the other plant milks that are out there, and many other ones. And there's no difference between the added vitamin B12 and that's what's naturally in food. So it's definitely important to make sure that you get enough vitamin B12 because if you don't, you might not see the effects right away. We do store a little bit of vitamin B12 in our liver. So if you just switch to a vegan diet, you might have a few years, but how do you know? So don't assume you have a few years of B12 stored up. Make sure you get enough in your diet. It's very important. It can cause nerve damage, serious nerve damage if you don't get enough. But again, I think that because vegan and vegetarian is so popular now, there are a lot of fortified foods. Vegetable cereals are fortified as well. So.
And we just had a person ask about sharing the Dirty Dozen list again. So this is on environmental group, so ewg.org. Here's the Dirty Dozen list here. Strawberries, spinach, kale, nectarines, apples, grapes, peaches.
And another list that you might notice, they have a clean 15, and those are the 15 foods that aren't generally a problem. So if you're thinking, oh, do I need to buy everything organic? These are the ones that are not as important to buy organic because they're not as likely to be contaminated by pesticides. So if you're not ready to buy everything, and it's pretty hard to buy everything organic, but you can certainly.
So that's the Clean 15.
Yeah.
And the last website that I just wanted to bring up that Nancy and I talked about today was the Save the Food. And the reason I like this one is if you go to the recipes page, can you see that? Is it showing?
Yes.
Okay. If you go to the recipes page, there's recipes for everything from overripe avocados to cheese rinds. So ugly vegetable pasta. Anyway, I thought this was really great. Cooking with food scraps. So for the hardcore folks out there, I think this is a great option.
Yes. Because sometimes we have this leftover food and we can't think, what do I do with this thing? So.
Okay, and then the last question is, you mentioned coffee but didn't go into depth. How bad is it?
Oh, well, you know what? Actually, there's a lot of positive research on coffee. So in terms of health, there even seem to be some health benefits. I mean, you know, people have different levels of sensitivity to caffeine, but in general, coffee is not really a, oh, it's really bad for you kind of thing. In terms of the environmental impact, obviously it's grown in Central America, et cetera. So I would recommend buying the shade grown, organic, fair trade. Fair trade foods are, they work with the growers and they make sure that they get a fair wage and good working conditions. So that's another way of, you know, thinking about the ethics of what you're buying. And that's also true of chocolate, that you can buy chocolate, fair trade, ethical, etc. Certainly you can't buy it local, but my goodness, chocolate isn't it a necessity? So yeah, I mean, you're not going to be able to buy everything local, but you can certainly do the best you can. So don't worry about coffee. You know, my goodness, if we put down coffee in Seattle, that would be, yeah. I see a happy note down there. There are ways of doing it well.
Thank you so much, Nancy. All right, so I would love to now introduce our second speaker, and Nancy will be here also for questions at the end. So our next speaker is Ram Hariharan, and I'm sure, Ram, I'm saying your name incorrectly, and I apologize. But Ram is an entrepreneur with an MBA in sustainable business, and Ram spent most of his career leading engineering teams at major tech companies like Microsoft and Expedia. And after completing his MBA at Pinchot, now part of Presido Graduate School, Ram started an employee group with Expedia to promote sustainable business practices. Before he left, the group included over 100 employees across 5 countries who organized dozens of events and guided Expedia's operations to more sustainable choices, including offsets for more than 1 million kilograms of carbon emissions from business travel. That's awesome. He's currently working on an early stage startup called Connected Citizen and an app to facilitate and encourage voter participation. Perfect timing. So that website is https://app.connected-citizen.com. So thank you, Ram, for being here.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm going to go ahead and share my presentation. Did you want to go ahead and start the survey? Let's see here. Can you hear me okay? Oh, there it is. Excellent. So while we're getting started, just sort of curious to see how many people are already familiar with the term permaculture. And this is either a very long explanation for a very small concept that you might remember a little bit of later, or a very short introduction to a very big concept that you may choose to study more about after the presentation. All right.
All right, so I'm gonna go ahead, looks like about 80% of us had voted. I'll go ahead and stop there and share the results. Did we freeze up or are we okay?
Looks like some people know a little bit about it, and that's excellent. And even better, some folks have used permaculture principles.
Awesome, okay.
All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. So that means I can go a little bit deeper for some folks, and for some folks, some of this will be review. Basically, the goal here is to give you an introduction. I'm starting with the premise that none of the details that I share with you today are things that you need to remember. So this is the time to just be thinking and to think about how what I'm about to share with you, as I'm sharing it, how it might change your perspective of very common things that you see every day. Okay, so we'll start with that introduction. We're going to use this structure to talk about permaculture in 4 different settings. The first is defining it. What is it? What is it about? The second is about how we can use it to produce food. Third is how we can scale those principles to change forest areas or small bioregions. And the final one, the fourth one, is the future, how it can become part of our future and how it can help us offset the carbon emissions of historic society. So let's go ahead and get started. The first is about first principles, and I like things that alliterate, so here you have first principles with an F. Permaculture is founded on the principle of ethics. And as you can see in that center of that circle, there's a small tree at the top, and then on the lower right, there's a group of people, and then a pie with a slice cut out of it. There's 3 things that ethics means in the context of permaculture. The first is taking care of the planet. The second is taking care of the people. And the third is making sure there's a fair share for everyone. It's a topic that I think everybody can relate to these days. These are the 12 permaculture principles. And yeah, it's overwhelming when you look at them because first of all, there's 12 of them. Second of all, they're somewhat abstract. So they may not have meaning for you at first until you have a few examples or you study it. And so that's kind of what we're going to do right now, is we're going to dig into 2 of those and give you a taste for how deep the rabbit hole goes. For tonight, the 2 that we're choosing is, first is observe and interact, and the second is use and value diversity. And you'll see why those are 2 very interesting ones to discuss tonight. Let's start with an exercise. And we're going to go to this picture here. And to kind of aid your observation, I put a list of things like light, water, soil, animal life, plants. Those are some of the things that a permaculture designer would use, lenses to use to look at a space. But as you look at this space, you probably just see a bunch of plants, right? That's what I saw when I first started my exploration here. As you look a little more closely though, what you start noticing is that there's an area over on the right. You can see where that fence is, so that you can see the fence and there's nothing growing there. But over on the left, right near the edge of the fence, you can see big bushes of things, right? So that's one observation to make. And that actually has to do with the light. It also has to do with water and to some extent animal life, believe it or not. I won't go into too much detail, but one of the things that people notice when they see this picture is they say, wow, that's a lot of weeds. Maybe you agree, right? It's a lot of weeds. So what do we mean when we talk about weeds? We're going to take a short diversion from observe and interact to talk a little about the value of diversity, valuing and using diversity. In traditional agriculture, there are plants that are productive plants and there are plants that we call weeds. And there's nice categories, right? In traditional agriculture, we think of weeds as being invaders, things to fight. There's a battle with weeds. We've got to spray things on them. They're garbage that grows in our beautiful gardens, and they're nutrient thieves, and they're bad things. But I want to invite you to have to look at this a little differently, from a different perspective, and see if I can't change your mind about weeds. Let's ask a question this way. What happens to uncovered soil? As you look at this picture, you can probably see there was water here. You can see that gully where there was very clear water erosion. But as you look, you can also see that most of the plants are dry and dead. So there was water here, but it was only here briefly, only long enough to make this gully and run off to someplace else. And this is the story of water erosion on bare soil. I learned actually something very interesting. The biggest step in that erosion is when water falls from the sky. And there are many areas in the world, believe it or not, that actually get plenty of rainfall, but that are completely dry desert, or desert-like areas. Desert's maybe a more specific term. And the reason is the rain falls, it dislodges some of the dirt because rain is very heavy when it hits the ground at terminal velocity. It dislodges some of the dirt, and the sheet flow takes some of this dirt away. So you have literally dirt being washed away. Now, eventually what will happen is it will form channels, and those channels form a place where the water can go even faster. However, if you have a plant there, or if you have leaf litter covering the ground and a plant, then the water will hit the plant and then drip onto the leaf litter, and then it has time to soak into the ground. This is one of the principles in permaculture, is you want to like you want to gather resources. Water is one of those resources. And how do you gather resources? Well, if you have bare ground, you need somebody to come and help you, right? So in that context, a weed is no longer this menace to civilization. It really is a volunteer. It's a first responder for the danger of bare ground to an ecosystem. Me, I have a sustainable business background, so I like to call it the entrepreneurs of the plant kingdom, because they are first in to see brownfield opportunities, and they show up and they set up shop to help protect and provide a service to the broader ecosystem. Hopefully some of you guys are laughing at that. I thought that was pretty funny. So in permaculture, we actually look at weeds quite a bit differently. We think of them as volunteers, as I mentioned. They're moisture protectors because they help, like if you think about a dandelion root, dandelions have these very deep kind of tap roots. They actually help water go into the soil. So they're like little spots where you can add additional drains away from the surface. They're also soil indicators. They provide a lot of purpose and value when you know how to observe them and know how to use them. So going to a little more specific illustration of this, again, to really make this point. If you go back to that, remember that picture we saw with the fence and the field and the slope. When you have just a bare slope, if I had taken off all that grass, or whoever it was had taken off all that grass and just had bare ground and planted a few things like in a garden, what would have happened is a lot of the water that was arriving would have just sheeted right off. However, once you start putting plants there and those plants cover the ground, what you start getting is moisture going into the soil rather than just sheeting off. The other thing that you can do is you can make use of weeds in a different way. This is sort of another interesting picture. So this is all material that was harvested on site. There's a little plant in the middle with the red ribbon to make it easier to see. It was actually an experiment. This is one of those interactions to see if blackberry canes would prevent slugs from eating this plant. They did not. They did not. It were mixed evidence there. But as you notice, the way the grass has been situated there with the sticks and the grass, those are intended to slow down the flow of water and help protect the soil. Eventually, that grass will break down and become really great compost in which to plant other plants. And so what you can do is you can use those weeds as volunteers, as materials to help build your garden. A technique that some people will be familiar with as chop and drop. But the real reason probably why you're here is you're interested in learning how you can grow food. And I will give you just one example of something called a guild. We're not going to go into detail. Permaculture is a very vast and deep subject. But just to give you a little taste of how you can think about permaculture in your garden. As you grow food, what you want to do, permaculture perspective, is think about guilds. How you can have plants that grow together that help each other grow more healthy. You use weeds, you distract or use pests, and then of course, obviously you harvest. So we're going to talk about one specific example from the Haudenosaunee tribe in northeast United States. They discovered something very interesting. So this is a corn plant, and if you look at it by itself, it has a certain set of characteristics. It needs a lot of nitrogen, a lot of water, et cetera, right? By itself, it's really hard to grow. So you need to add a lot of nutrients. You got to add fertilizers, you got to water, you can do all this stuff. But what happens if you can put it together with other plants? You actually gain a synthesis, something that's better than its separate parts, component parts, when you put them together. When you take the corn and you grow it with beans and squash, what you get is something that's called the Three Sisters Guild. This was used by the Haudenosaunee tribe to actually get 20% more food out of the same growing area. And as you can tell, each of those plants contributes something to the other two plants in the guild. And because they're so densely planted, what happens is the water vapor given off by one plant is available to keep moisture into another plant. And so they actually, you can use less water because they're actually preserving the water in that area. These guilds can extend to much larger groupings. So for example, the local Beacon Hill Food Forest, they've got a number of illustrations of how guilds can be used. And I'm going to take a quick look at the chat. Excellent. And so they're actually worth visiting. They're here in the Seattle area. You can go take a look. They have tours and they have also just self-guided, you can go visit type of things. Moving on, just a quick, because I'd be ashamed to have you leave here without any specifics about how to use permaculture. Here's a couple of things. Marigolds. So marigolds, slugs love marigolds. Love is not too strong a word. And so you put marigolds at either end of your garden, and it helps gives the slugs something to be attracted to, and they love that more. So either you can sort of just plant more marigolds, or if you want to, you can harvest those slugs and feed them to your chickens. There's no waste in permaculture. Everything is food for something else. I found this over this last summer, that I had a little area where my lawn was getting overtaken by buttercups, and I found that I could grow squash over that, because squash, it loves the wet soil, and it kind of is one of the few things that could outcompete the buttercups. And you can use pole beans, like those people grow pole beans to grow leafy vegetables. So you get some idea. When you start mixing things, you take one thing, the characteristic of one thing, and combine it with a characteristic of another thing, you can get synergies that allow you to get more for the same amount of effort. So you do less work and you get more delight, which is ultimately what permaculture is about. If you're working hard at permaculture, you might be doing it the wrong way. So something to think about. Going on, this concept scales, and if it's to have the kind of impact that we'd like it to have, it does need to scale to broader regions. Here's an example. It's actually a really interesting story. This is in Vancouver. A friend of mine, Oliver Kellhammer, was the artist who did this. And what was happening was they cut this bridge, cut a lot of trees down, and there was this hillside that was eroding. And you know, think about, if you were just based on what you learned just now about permaculture, can you see what's wrong with this picture? Yeah, the water's just going to run right down, right? And as the water runs down, what is it going to do? It's going to carry soil. So he made a proposal to the city of Vancouver, rather than having them spend millions of dollars to put a bunch of concrete on this hillside. He says, look, give me a year or 2 years, I think it was. And if I can fix this, literally I can do this for like $20,000. And they said, okay, this is crazy, but it's worth a try. What he did was he first enlisted help, because he knew he couldn't do it by himself. But notice how he enlisted help. This is very permaculture. He realized, this is a common thing, birds that eat seeds poop seeds. And often those seeds, when you think about it, they've got fertilizer and they've kind of been etched so they can sprout. So they're going to sprout. That's how come blackberries spread so far. One of the reasons. So what he did was he started by doing something. Again, you probably recognize this. Do you see what's happening? It's a stick. And that stick, those sticks there are placed to slow down the flow of water enough that the water can stay there, just form a little pool where seeds that he's planting willow, little pieces of willow to help things grow. And so gradually he's got now some willow growing there. He's got those bird houses to kind of enlist the birds to come and bring their seeds and help fertilize the soil there. And eventually what happens is this willow has, the reason why it's so beneficial here is that it contains, it produces compounds, salicylic acid and auxins that wash from the willow into the surrounding soil, promote root growth, reduce pathogenic bacteria that would otherwise attack soil roots, and as a windbreak, it attracts bees. There's a whole bunch of things that it does, but it is now the part of what's called a succession. So you start off with willow, fast growing, gets in there, starts, shading and preserving the soil. And then other things grow a little more slowly. Remember we talked about first responders? It's kind of like a first responder. Eventually, once the first responders have stabilized the initial part of that soil, there's time now for bigger trees to take root and to grow and do further soil stabilization. This is now a place where people harvest in the community. People will go and pick fruit off the fruit trees. It's a bird area, so people actually, there's binoculars there where you can look at the different birds that come to nest and to eat fruit. And it's now become a thing of beauty as opposed to, an eyesore that could have just been a big concrete wall, right? So you get a sense for permaculture is about making use of these principles to enlist the power of nature rather than working against it or fighting it. This can even work on regional scale. There's an example here that's quite interesting. And really, as you look at this, you start realizing that as we apply these principles in larger scale, we can make a difference in the climate through how we choose to eat and how we choose to inhabit the various regions we inhabit in the planet. This is an area in China. It's across like 3 different provinces in China, and it's been like this desolate sort of landscape for probably 1,000 years or so. And they decided that they were going to use permaculture principles to reforest it. Do you notice anything there? Do you notice what they're trying to do? They're slowing down the water. It's the one thing they did. They made terraces, and you see all those holes on the hillside? They're going to plant things there. And as they slow down the water, eventually, across many years, what you have now is a lush area where people can grow food, where trees are growing. You have probably millions of tons of carbon being stored in the soil and the plants that are growing there, and the animals that then grow and eat, and so on and so forth. And you create prosperity just because you started by slowing down the water. There's a lot to permaculture. Ultimately, the goal here is to have more delight with less work, creating a better future for yourself, for your neighborhood, and for your planet. And for those who like more visual review, we talked about first principles, some ethics at the core of permaculture. We talked about how to observe and interact. We talked about how to value and use diversity. We talked about a little bit about how we could use guilds. Remember the Three Sisters Guild to produce food for ourselves with more delight and less work. We also talked about how forests and ultimately our future can be better through the use of permaculture. I know I've kind of whipped through this really quickly. The goal here is not to have you learn everything about permaculture, because there are literally 2 weeks and 5-month-long courses where you can get just the basics. But to introduce you to a concept that hopefully you'll be curious about and think about next time you see a dandelion, or next time you see a buttercup, you'll know what kind of a job they're doing and that they're not just an enemy. I'm happy to answer questions. Let me see here.
You see the one from Deborah. It says, how long did it take for both the Vancouver and China reforestation projects?
For Vancouver, my recollection was it took about 2 years to have at least the where they had lots of bushes growing. And then I think it was by the time the trees, it was probably more like 5 or 10 years. But they saw the results very quickly. Within that first year, they saw the stabilization that they were looking for. And so the city wanted to continue. It's actually preserved as kind of an artistic work. It was a very interesting story. In China, that actually, to get to the end product, I think was something like 10 years. So it was a long, long period of time. But you can see some of the results very quickly.
And Amy shared that the China project was on PBS show called Age of Nature. So that's something
Very cool
to look up. And Nancy said, any good books that you would recommend?
Well, there are a lot of books about permaculture gardening. Off the top of my head, so I I knew someone who was going through their permaculture design certification, so I got quite a lot of permaculture through that, and they've got a ton of books, some of which are super thick. Off the top of my head, I can't give you a specific recommendation, but there are lots of really good books. An example of guilds in my own backyard. So one of the things that we did in my backyard garden was we have chickens, and so chickens are not exactly a plant guild if you want to think about it that way, but we have raised beds. There's actually a funny video. It's called the Garden Girl's Guide to Urban Gardening or something like that. I forgot her name, but it was something urban gardening, urban container gardening. And there's this funny video where this woman took 8-foot lumber and she cut one in half and then made these little raised beds. And in those raised beds, she had little chicken coops that she would move. She had 12 of them. So she'd move one each month. It was Vancouver, BC. And in each of those, she would have something where she'd have her chickens, then she'd have rabbits, then she'd have, she'd plant some leafy vegetables. So we have chickens. The chickens do a lot of scratching around there and pooping, obviously. So it's very rich soil in those raised beds. One of the things we did was with our legumes, with our pole beans, we had poles there to kind of provide a little bit of shade. Honestly, I'm still experimenting, so it didn't work out that great because it was in an area where I didn't pay much attention to. So they got kind of overgrown, and we harvested a bunch of beans off them. It was exciting, but beans are a good one for shade. So you grow the beans up on a trellis, and that provides some shade for leafy vegetables like cabbage or lettuce that prefer to have shade. So that's an example where you could do something in your backyard pretty easily. And the beans provide nitrogen for the cabbage or lettuce that actually need a lot of nitrogen to produce leaves. Native plants. So there are people who are much more expert on specific native plants because it really depends on what you're trying to grow. So for example, there are low growing things like salal, and I'm trying to think, there's a heather. There's also, so one of the things you can do is when if you have a tall tree, one of the plants that loves shade is the huckleberry, the mountain huckleberry. So that's a natural guild. So if you have a fruit tree, planting a shade-loving huckleberry under that tree is a nice way to get an additional crop and help prevent weeds from growing around the base of the tree. But again, this is a very detailed topic, and every backyard is different. And so the guilds that make sense for your backyard might be very different from the guilds that make sense in my backyard. Partially because of the way the light is, what kind of soil do you have, what kind of access to water. Like we have water that kind of comes sheeting down a hill because we live kind of on a hill. So, there's applying those permaculture principles. Part of what I'm trying to do is introduce you to the idea of the principles so that you can take those and look at your own backyard with different eyes. One of the things that, I'll give you another example of just a crazy use. Squash, I've noticed, tends to like to grow out from something, right? It's probably not very specific, but there was an edge along the yard, and I had this crazy idea. I thought, I like butternut squash and I like delicata squash. So I took seeds from an organic squash and I just put them in a container, like a tray, with some dirt. I'm curious to see if they come up. Well, quite a few of them did come up. And then I was trying to figure out what to do with them. So what I did was at the edge of the yard, at the very edge of the yard between like the shrubs and the main yard, I just cut a little 1-foot strip out of the yard and I planted these seeds there. And much to my surprise, they grew great. In fact, they even took over the area where the buttercups were. And that was fun to see. So you just need to kind of experiment and figure out what kind of niche do you need for the plant you want to grow. Find a way to create that niche and then experiment. It may work, it might not work, but it always leads to learning. And yes, there are classes available for learning more about permaculture. There are online programs, there are in-person programs. There are places sometimes you can go to like California, there's some in Costa Rica, some in Australia. There are a lot of ways you can get a permaculture design certificate. The PDC is kind of the main certification there. I don't know how we're doing on time.
We're doing fine.
Good. All right. We can go a little bit further if folks were still curious. I kind of whipped through that very quickly to give you kind of a rough idea of the topic and more to whet your appetite for your own curiosity. So let's see if I can get this. There we go. This is the permaculture principles with each of them specifically named. I don't know if you have any questions about them. I know enough about permaculture to be dangerous, I guess, to experiment.
I love the concepts of how everybody has their value and helps one another, and it just shows how awesome nature is.
It really truly fascinating. Oh, excellent. Okay, that's a great question. So design pattern to detail. Let me see if I can find. Actually, I have one of the slides in my appendix. I think might be interesting. So this was a slide that I decided not to put in just because it didn't seem to fit. But here's one of the principles is use and capture energy, right? Capture and use energy. And one of the sources of energy for a permaculture garden is sunlight. So if you look at it in traditional, traditional advice about gardening is that you've got some good areas that are, right here where you get nice direct sunshine, and other areas that maybe are not as good because they get shaded by the house. And in permaculture, you're using each of those areas for what they're best for. Like, you don't want to store your water where there's a lot of light because you get evaporation and algae growth and stuff like that. And you can still grow trees even in a fairly somewhat shaded area, because trees are going to reach fairly high and they'll have access to the sun in ways that small plants don't, and they may not need as much direct sunlight. So there's an idea of looking at the pattern of capturing and using energy applied to a very specific garden. So you want to look at how sun falls on your garden area, and that takes time. We're not as used to thinking about that. At least I wasn't. I was fairly like, it's a shrubbery. Okay, who cares? It's got sunlight. It'll grow. This isn't Minecraft, people. You actually need to think about, is it morning sun? Is it afternoon sun? That area that we saw, that little alleyway, it was shaded kind of on two sides. Now it was on a north-south line, but you could actually see, if you looked close, if you look with an observing eye, you could see places where plants are growing here because they don't get the harsh afternoon sun. Places where they did get the harsh afternoon sun didn't grow as much. There's very small plants. And so now okay, if I'm going to grow something in that area that gets the harsh afternoon sun, I have to think about water. I have to think about what kind of thing is going to grow there, right? And not something, because in permaculture, you don't want to have to be always watering, right? You want to create guilds that are things that are grouped together where you can plant them. Maybe they need a little bit of water when you first plant them to get started. But in general, over time, they're not going to need to continue to be watered deeply, especially here in the Northwest. Although in the summer, we do have a very dry summer. I don't know, does that answer your question about design pattern to detail sufficiently, or is there more? Let's see. I can also share one more thing. Let me see here. It's interesting. The question about animals was it's quite a topic. This is a slide from a talk by Alan Savory. I'll put his name in the chat. He's started the Savory Institute. What they do is they use herd animals like cows and goats. And what he said was, he's making the claim, he's lived in Africa all his life. And he makes the claim that if we properly used herd animals through grass feeding, we could actually reverse deserts. And he's done it in a number of areas that were formerly dry and arid, because of that same principle we talked about with water. Basically capturing water and keeping it there on the soil, slowing it down, is key to the success of bringing back and revitalizing devastated landscapes. And his claim, and I haven't done any looking at his math, but his claim was that if we did in Africa and some places of the Southwest and there in South America and Australia as well, if we did more of this kind of large herds grazing in patterns to promote plant growth, we could reverse climate change without making any other changes. It's a pretty bold claim. But even if he's only partially true, even if it's a substantial increase in the amount of carbon that we can store in natural environments, it's still worth looking into. And it's similar to permaculture principles. What he does is he has herd animals. If you just let them do what they want, they'll eat just the things they like. But if you force them together like they were in nature for safety, and you force them through certain paths, they'll eat everything. They'll bite everything. And what happens is when animals bite the plants get a signal that they've been attacked and they need to grow back. So it stimulates their growth. And the cows are pooping and peeing and kind of churning up the ground with their hooves. So the next time it rains, there's a lot of poop and there's a lot of nitrogen and a lot of holes for water to start growing and for plants to benefit from that water soaking in. You do that 3 or 4 times. He's got great examples in his TED Talk on YouTube where he's completely dramatically changed vast 1,000-acre areas from deserts into lush grasslands. So it's another an example of how these permaculture principles play a role in how we can turn around what's going on the planet. If there aren't any other questions, feel free to ask more later. There's also the resources that will go out to the attendees, as I understand.
Yes. So look in your email tomorrow. There'll be those. And so I just have a few final slides, and that was like such a great introduction to this. Thank you, Ram. For those that are ready to take action, here's a couple of upcoming opportunities. Of course, we've talked about the Shoreline Climate Challenge, and I have some really exciting news. So I wanted to share that the community recently hit our goal for the Shoreline Climate Challenge. This challenge website has lots of great information for people looking for tips on how to reduce your emissions associated with food choices. And this city of Shoreline still has a few prizes left for households that compete at least one action before the end of October. So take a look at that. You can learn more and sign up at shorelineclimatechallenge.org. So great work, everybody. And then also, how about if I put this in presentation? Here we go. There. Okay, and then also coming up is the last of the natural yard care sessions is tomorrow night. So just in time to talk about fall garden prep. That is how to create a tidy winter garden that restores itself for spring. The garden hotline experts will cover fall cleanup practices like mulching and pruning. They'll keep your garden clean and help it thrive for next season. So that's happening tomorrow night at 6:30 p.m. And you can register again at www.shorelinewa.gov/natural yard care. And 2 more quick events. There's a free recycling workshop coming up on Thursday, November 5th at 6:30. And although I grew up in Shoreline and I know Shoreline has been recycling since, I believe, 1990, maybe even the late 80s. So you really do a great job in your city. I want to encourage people to really consider attending this event. Even as a master recycler myself, since the rules have changed, I used to work at Waste Management. I worked there in 2012 and 13. And in 2017, we had a professional come speak to our group about the updated rules. And you would be surprised. I was surprised. I actually had some things wrong. So it's really something I wanted to encourage everyone to go to. So you can register on the Shoreline, City of Shoreline website. You can find it on the calendar there. So really wanted to encourage people to go to that, or on the Recology website. And the other event, excuse me, coming up is the Story of Plastic. Also wanted to let you know about that. It's a free online viewing of the documentary, The Story of Plastic. It takes place on Saturday, November 14th. It's 2020 film that takes a sweeping look at the man-made crisis of plastic pollution and the worldwide effect it has on the health of our planet and the people who inhabit it. The film will be followed by a conversation about how you can help create a waste-free world. So that'll be really cool. Again, Saturday, November 14th. Just back to the recycling one for one moment, I forgot to mention, oops, excuse me, this direction. You know, this workshop is specifically for shoreline area folks, so you can find out how to properly prepare your recyclables for collection, clean, empty, dry, and why they need to be that way, what's accepted in there, and also guidance on items you might be seeing more today, such as cleaning wipes, masks, and disposable utensils, and why it's important to sort and prepare your recyclables. So I just wanted to say that. And last but not least, can't believe it, but next week is our final session on communicating like a champion for the climate. And I am really excited about this. We have Emily Moberg, who's going to be speaking and has a great presentation plan for us. And it's such a valuable tool to learn tips and tricks on how to best communicate about climate change, because not everybody is as positive in talking about it as we are. So, you know, learn how to overcome objections and really hear what people are saying and be able to communicate in a way that makes it so that they can hear what you're saying. So I look forward to seeing everyone again next week. And